Hello again, and I wish you a peaceful and blessed Saturday evening, local time from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Miss Melinda Loveless was a teenager who, with some other teenage girls, devised a plan to abduct, torture, and murder a younger girl who had fallen in love with a girl who had been um, Miss Loveless's girlfriend. So this was a lesbian um, jealousy crime, even though the other girls involved probably were not lesbians. While Miss Melinda Loveless grew up in a very dysfunctional family, her father being extremely unfaithful to her mother, and her mother also having affairs of her own, except for those a few years when they belonged to a Baptist church. And eventually, then it became apparent that despite professing to be a born again Christian, and despite even having become a lay preacher and a counselor, Mr. Loveless uh, made unwanted sexual advances towards women who came to counseling sessions, and eventually he was fired from that ministry, and then they left the church. So, probably what a huge part of the reason why Miss Loveless, aside from teenage jealousy, because this younger girl had stolen her lover as if there wouldn't have been other teenagers available to be romantically involved with her, like these love jealousy crimes, especially when they are committed by teenagers or in extreme cases, perhaps even by children nowadays. They are so sad, so tragic, and so totally unnecessary. Like they really, and well, of course, when adults commit them, as if there was no one, absolutely no one else in the world who could take that so-called lost or stolen girlfriend's or boyfriend's place. I mean, get a life. And this also shows how far we have as societies and as individuals um, strayed from God. When God isn't at the center of our lives, we use all kinds of substitutes, surrogates for Him, like girlfriends, boyfriends, mistresses, wives, husbands, and so forth. And then there are already nowadays couples who are so-called swingers, who have not only have open marriages where they can have at least up to a point as many extramarital affairs as they want, but also they engage in group sex with consenting adults. And while I didn't find on Murderpedia any evidence that either Mr. Loveless or Mrs. Loveless, this poor girl's parents, who unfortunately murdered with her friends another girl, a younger girl, would have engaged in that. Nevertheless, these are symptoms of a wider disease that affects all human beings and all human societies, regardless of the majority religion or church, regardless of the political or economic system, regardless of the social system, regardless of the, for example, the distribution of wealth, regardless of nowadays how badly or um, mildly it's affected or they are affected by the coronavirus pandemic. And the disease is sin. And I never, when I review these cases and go over them with you, I never feel the slightest degree of contempt for these perpetrators. I feel hated them, are precious human beings. Yes, they have in many ways perverted and defiled the gifts of God, often because of poor upbringing, I will admit, often because of hanging out with wrong kinds of friends, in quotation marks, who have actually encouraged them to experiment more and more with sin of various kinds. And we have to remember that this crime took place back in 1992, when the internet as we know it was in its infancy, the World Wide Web having only been invented in 1989. Now, when children who are not even attending school of any kind can learn to watch hardcore violence and so forth on their cell phones or on their parents' or siblings' or friends' cell phones, and especially if their parents are not vigilant or watchful enough, unfortunately, we can expect that these kinds of crimes are still going to continue. Hopefully, they will gradually decrease. And of course, the best cure for that is a powerful Christian revival. So let's get to the actual case now. So, Melinda Loveless was born in October 1975, and on January the 11th, 1992, aged 16, she and some of her friends engaged in the murderous torture of a 12-year-old girl, Shanda Renee Scherer. In order to avoid the death penalty, the crime took place in Madison, Indiana, the United States. She pled guilty. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison on October the 6th, 1992, and her projected date of release is February the 8th, 2021. Maybe she has shown so good behavior and so deep remorse for her crime that the authorities feel that she can be released in now under 7 months. So Shanda Renee Scherer, who was the victim, had been born in June 1979 at Pineville Community Hospital in Pineville, Kentucky. Um, she attended 5th and 6th grades in Louisville at St. Paul School, where she was on the cheerleading, volleyball, and softball teams. After Scherer's parents, Steve Scherer and Jacqueline Vaught, divorced, her mother remarried and the family moved to Louisville. When her mother divorced again, the family moved to New Albany, Indiana in June 1991. Shanda subsequently enrolled at Hazelwood Middle School. Early in the school year, she transferred to Our Lady of Perpetual Help School, a Catholic school in New Albany, where she joined the school's female basketball team. Her chief murderer, Melinda Loveless, had been born in New Albany, Indiana in October 1975, so she was over 3.5 years older than her victim. The youngest of three daughters to Marjorie and Larry Loveless. Larry had been drafted into or required to join the US Army during the Vietnam War. On his return, he had been treated as a hero. His wife later described him as a sexually perverted man who would even wear her and her daughter's underwear and makeup, was incapable of staying monogamous, and had a mixture of jealousy and fascination with seeing his wife being sexually involved with other men and women. They lived in or near New Albany, Indiana throughout Melinda's childhood. So I'm going to fast forward now. In November 1990, Larry was caught spying on Melinda and a friend, and Marjorie attacked him with a knife, sending him to the hospital after he attempted to grab it. She then attempted suicide again, and her daughters called authorities. After this incident, Larry filed for a divorce and moved to Avon Park, Florida. Melinda felt crushed, especially as Larry remarried. He sent letters to her for a while, playing on her emotions, but eventually then refused to have any contact with her. Then Miss Loveless's accomplices. Mary Laureen Tackett, commonly known as Laurie Tackett, was born in Madison, Indiana in October 1974, so she was 17 at the time of Shanda's murder. While her mother was a fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian, her father was a factory worker who had been convicted of 2 felonies in the 1960s. Tackett later claimed that she had been molested at least twice as a child at ages 5 and 12. In May 1989, her mother discovered that Tackett was changing into jeans at school, and after a confrontation that night, attempted to strangle her. While, given her fundamentalist beliefs. I can understand her anger at her daughter for changing into jeans. If I had been in Mrs. Tackett's place, I would certainly not have become violent. I would simply have said that we would prefer you to wear a traditional dress. But, well, I mean, I personally, as long as they otherwise behave decently, um, I'm not so strict about how students dress. Not so strict. Social workers were involved, and Tackett's parents agreed to unannounced visits to ensure that child abuse was not occurring. However, the conflicts between Miss Tackett and her mother continued. On one occasion, her mother went to Hope Rippey's house after learning that Rippey's father had purchased a Ouija board for the girls, used for occultist games or even seances. She demanded that the board be burnt and that the Rippey house be exorcised. In other words, ritually through prayer, intercessory prayer, and casting out demons be cleansed of demons. Tackett became increasingly rebellious after her 15th birthday and also became fascinated with the occult. She started to engage in self harm, as did the other girls who were involved. She dropped out of high school in September 1991. So just about 4 or 3.5 months before this murder. Tackett stayed in the Louisville area in October 1991 to live with various friends. She met Melinda Loveless. However, the two only befriended each other in late November 1991. In December of that year, Tackett moved back to Madison on the promise that her father would buy her a car. She still spent most of her time in Louisville and New Albany, and by December 1991, most of it with Melinda Loveless. Hope Rippey was born in Madison, Indiana in June 1976, so she was 15 at the time of this group murder. Her father was an engineer at a power plant. Her parents divorced in February 1984, and she moved to Quincy, Michigan with her mother and siblings for 3 years. According to her claims, living with her family in Michigan was somewhat turbulent. Her parents resumed their relationship in Madison in 1987. She was reunited with friends Laurie Tackett and Tony Lawrence, whom she had known since childhood, although her parents saw Tackett as a bad influence. As the other girls who were involved in this group murder, ritualistic group murder, Rippey began to self-harm at age 15. Tony Lawrence was born in Madison, Indiana in February 1976. So she was 14 at the time of the murder. I have to check the date. Yes, because it happened in January 1992. Her father was a boilermaker. She was Hope Rippey's close friend from childhood onward. She was abused by a relative at age 9 and was raped by a teenage boy at age 14. She went into counseling after the incident but did not follow through. She then started to have affairs with multiple boys, to cut herself, and then she attempted suicide in 8th grade. So in 1990, Melinda Loveless had met and begun dating Amanda Heverin. After her father left and her mother remarried, Loveless was deeply depressed, in counseling and fighting at school. In March 1991, Loveless confessed to her mother that she had become a lesbian. Her mother initially was outraged, but eventually accepted her daughter's changed sexual orientation. In the fall of 1990, Loveless's relationship with Heverin deteriorated, and Loveless then, in her jealousy, began to associate this deterioration with Shanda Scherer. Heverin and Scherer met early in the school year when they got into a fight. However, they became friends while in detention. Loveless immediately became jealous of Heverin and Scherer's relationship. In early October 1991, Scherer and Heverin attended a school dance where Loveless found them and confronted them. Although Heverin and Loveless never formally ended their involvement, Loveless began dating an older girl. Loveless then became increasingly jealous when Heverin and Scherer went to a festival together in late October 1991. she began then to discuss killing Scherer and publicly threatened Scherer. Concerned about their daughter's relationship with Hebron, Scherer's parents arranged for her to transfer to a Catholic school in late November 1991, and the girl started drifting apart in December 1991. Loveless and Hebron, however, never became partners again, never resumed their dating relationship. So, in retrospect, and of course, with hindsight, we could say that it would have been wiser, given this jealousy for the Scherer family, to move to another city or town, and preferably even to another state. So far enough for Melinda Loveless to have no chance whatsoever to catch Shanda Scherer, let alone to torture and ritually kill her. Sadly, her parents thought that simply changing schools but staying in the same city would be enough. In this case, sadly, tragically, it wasn't. So on January the 10th, 1992, the Christmas holidays had just ended, I think, or were about to end. Tony Lawrence, Hope Rippey, and Laurie Tackett drove in Tackett's car from Madison, Indiana to Melinda Loveless's house in New Albany. Rippey and Lawrence, while Tackett's friends, had not yet met Loveless. However, when they arrived, they borrowed some clothes from Loveless, and she showed them a knife and told them she was going to scare Shanda Scherer with it. So she was actually lying. She had already decided to murder Shanda. But probably she did it tactically. She lied tactically because had she told them point blank that she was going to kill this younger girl that night, probably at least one or two of the other girls would not have wanted to accompany her, since all of them were old enough to know the risks involved, especially if they got caught. None of the girls except for Loveless had ever met Scherer, although Tackett already knew of the plan to intimidate the 12-year-old girl. Tackett then let Rippey drive them to Scherer's house in Jeffersonville, Indiana, stopping at a McDonald's restaurant for directions. Shortly before dark, they arrived at Scherer's house. Loveless then instructed Rippey and Lawrence to go to the door, introduce themselves as friends of Hebron, and invite Scherer to come with them to see her girlfriend, who was waiting for them at a place called the Witch's Castle. Scherer initially refused, saying that her parents were awake, and told the girls to come back around midnight. At first, Loveless lost her temper, but Rippey and Lawrence assured her that they could return for Scherer later. The four girls crossed the river to Louisville and went to a punk rock concert at the Audubon skate park near Interstate 65. Lawrence and Rippey quickly lost interest in the music and went to the parking lot outside the skate park, where they engaged in sexual activities with two boys in Tackett's car. So they had a lot of pent up emotions. So going to a rock concert, having sex before actually participating in this killing. Inwardly, they seem to have been out of control. And I'm very sad to say these things. Eventually, the girls left for Scherer's house. During the ride, Loveless said that she could not wait to kill Scherer. However, Loveless also said that she found Scherer attractive and would like to have sex with her. I think she was just making the story up. And then that she would simply use the knife to frighten the younger girl. When they arrived at Scherer's house at 12:30 a.m., Lawrence refused to retrieve Scherer, so Tackett and Rippey went. Loveless, who had previously harassed Scherer many times, hid under a blanket in the back seat of the car with a dull knife. Scherer, who innocently accompanied Tackett and Rippey and believed their false story about Hebron waiting at the witch's castle, however, she was reluctant, agreed after changing her clothes. So after Scherer got into the car, Loveless pounced on her, putting the knife to Scherer's throat as they got in the car and drove towards Utica, Indiana, and the witch's castle. The witch's castle was a ruined stone house, also known as Mistletoe Falls, located on an isolated hill overlooking the Ohio River. I just wonder if they had actually watched horror movies about some ritual killings. At least in Loveless's case, I would not be surprised if I found that to be true. Because, I mean, this looks like a scene from a horror movie. And to what extent these killings now in the first 2 decades of the 21st century have been inspired by, for example, horror movies, horror video games, horror videos, or horror stories that students can now easily read with their cell phones. I don't know. Tackett told the girls that legend said the house was once owned by 9 witches and townspeople burned the house to get rid of the witches. So at the witch's castle, they took Scherer in and bound her arms and legs with rope. Scherer predictably started to cry, and the girls were scared by the headlights of passing cars, so they left for a place near Tackett's house, stopping for gas, then getting lost for a while before finally making their way to Madison, Indiana. Tackett led them to a garbage dump off a logging road in a densely forested area. Lawrence and Rippey by that time became frightened and stayed in the car as Loveless and Tackett made Scherer strip. Then Loveless beat Scherer with her fists. Loveless repeatedly slammed Scherer's face into her knee, cutting Scherer's mouth uh, on her own braces. Loveless then tried to slash Scherer's throat, but the knife was too dull, and Rippey came out of the car to hold Scherer down. Loveless and Tackett took turns stabbing Scherer in the chest. Then they strangled Scherer with a rope until she was unconscious, placed her in the trunk, and told the other 2 girls that Scherer was dead. However, she wasn't. Meanwhile, the girls had gone to Tackett's nearby home and had gone inside to drink soda and clean themselves. Scherer started to scream in the trunk, so Tackett went out with a paring knife and stabbed her several more times, coming in a few minutes later covered in blood. And I so much wished that at least one of the parents would have been awake and would, of course, have called the police. If either one of Scherer's parents had been awake, I think that he or she would definitely have forbidden the 12-year-old girl, the 12-year-old daughter, from leaving, and would have considered those other girls suspicious, and rightly so. And if Tackett's parents had been awakened, or one of them, they would immediately, of course, he or she or they would have immediately demanded the girls to confess what they were doing, had done, and would have called in the police and ambulance. If only. I don't know how Melinda Loveless would have reacted. In the worst case scenario, Loveless might even have tried to commit suicide rather than being discovered and arrested, without her intended victim, yet having died. After she washed, Tackett got her rune stones in quotation marks and told the girls' futures with them. Lawrence and Rippey stayed behind as Tackett and Loveless went country cruising at 2:30 a.m., driving to the nearby town of Canaan. Scherer, however, was still alive, crying and gurgling, so Tackett stopped the car. Scherer sat up. She was covered in blood and her eyes rolled in the back of her head, but could no longer speak. Tackett then beat her with a tire iron until she was silent. They returned to Tackett's house just before daybreak in the morning to clean up again. Rippey asked about what had happened to Scherer, and Tackett laughingly told them about the torture. At that point, at last, Tackett's mother woke up and yelled at her daughter for being out so late and bringing home the girls, so Laurie agreed to take them home. She drove to the burn pile near Tackett's house and showed the other girls. Lawrence refused to look, and Rippey then, mockingly without any remorse whatsoever, sprayed Scherer with Windex and taunted, "You are not looking so hot now, are you?" Then the girls drove to a gas station near Madison Consolidated High School, pumped some gas into the car, and bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi, which Tackett emptied and refilled it with gasoline. They drove north of Madison past Jefferson Proving Ground to a place with which Rippey was familiar off US 421, so probably interstate road, I'm not sure, on what was called Lemon Road. They placed Scherer still alive. So after all this torture, she was still alive. If only Mrs. Tackett had actually, instead of only ordering her daughter to take them home, had started to ask questions. What were you actually doing? And if only she had become suspicious enough to call the police, then Sandy Scherer might still have been saved, although she would have been scarred and wounded for the rest of her life. If only. So then they drove north of Madison past Jefferson Proving Ground to a place. Okay. So on Lemon Road, they placed Shearer still alive in a blanket and carried her into a field by the gravel country road. Tackett made Rippey pour the gasoline on her, then they set her on fire. Loveless, however, was not convinced Shearer was dead, so they returned a few minutes later to pour the rest of the gasoline on her. Then they went to a McDonald's fast food restaurant at 9:30 a.m. for breakfast and laughed about Scherer looking like one of the sausages they were eating. Lawrence, however, had enough of her conscience left to become horrified and to call a friend and told to tell that friend about the murder. Tackett then dropped Lawrence and Rippey off at their homes and returned home with Loveless. Then they cleaned out the car using a hose to wash the trunk. After that, they drove to Loveless's house around 3 p.m. Loveless found out Hivrin was at River Falls Mall and had her paged, claiming an emergency, then told her that they had killed Scherer and arranged to pick Hivrin up later that day. Loveless's friend Crystal Wathen came over and they told her about what had happened. Then the three girls drove to pick up Hivrin and bring her back to Loveless's house, where they told Hivrin the story. While she did not believe it was true, she comforted the hysterical Loveless. Both Hivrin and Wathen were convinced when Tackett showed them the trunk with Scherer's bloody handprints and socks still there. Later on the morning of January the 11th, 1992, two brothers from Canaan, Indiana were driving toward Jefferson Proving Ground to go hunting when they noticed something on the side of the road. They called the police at 10:55 a.m. and were asked to return to the corpse of Shanda Shearer. The Jefferson County Sheriff, Buck Shipley, and detectives arrived and began an investigation, taking forensic evidence at the scene. At first, they suspected a drug deal gone wrong and could not believe the crime could be the work of locals. Early on January the 11th, 1992, Steve Shearer noticed his daughter missing, and then he called neighbors and friends all morning. After that, his former wife, Shanda's mother, and at 1:45 p.m., and the two met and filed a missing person report with the sheriff. At 8:20 p.m., Toni Lawrence, who had lost her calm completely, went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's office with her parents. She gave a rambling statement identifying the victim as Shanda, naming the three other girls involved as best she could, and describing the previous night's main events. Shipley contacted the Clark County Sheriff and was finally able to match the victim to Shanda Scherer's, Scherer's, not Shearer's, sorry for the mispronunciation, missing persons report. Detective Howard Henry went to the Scherer's house, then obtained dental records of Shanda that positively identified her as the victim. Already on January the 12th, 1992, Loveless and Tackett were arrested. Most of the evidence for the arrest warrant was Lawrence's statement. The prosecution immediately declared its intention to try both as adults. For several months, the prosecutors and defense attorneys did not release any information on the case, leaving the media only Lawrence's statement, which was repeated in the arrest warrant and contained the crime's general background. So, to avoid the death penalty, which, I mean, Well, if we acted according to the principles of retributive justice, at least two, possibly three of the girls would have deserved the death penalty. Definitely Loveless and Tackett. But then again, we may wonder, given their less than ideal childhood and youth, adolescence until then, and especially in Loveless's case, her very dysfunctional parents and upbringing, to what extent they were like normal emotionally anymore. Surely they understood what they did, but they had become so hardened emotionally that for them, good had become evil and evil had become good. So they didn't seem to have a moral compass anymore. The two other girls did, especially Lawrence, enough to feel great guilt and shame and remorse afterwards. With maximum time reduced for good behavior, and they could be released in 2020. Lawrence was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Tackett and Lawrence were sentenced to 60 years in prison in the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis. And now, as I read in the introduction to this lengthy video, Loveless is due to be released in February 2021. Lawrence was already released in 2000 with time reduced for good behavior. Rippey was sentenced to 60 years with 10 suspended for mitigating circumstances and 10 years of medium supervision probation with time reduced for good behavior. In October 2007, so over 15 and a half years after the murder, Loveless's attorney Mark Small requested a hearing to argue for his client's release. He said that Loveless had been, in quotation marks, profoundly retarded by childhood abuse and was not represented competently by counsel during her sentencing. I would say that she had been profoundly hardened, not retarded, which caused her to accept a plea only because of exaggerated claims about the chances of her being executed. Small also argued that Loveless, who was 16 when she signed the plea bargain, was too young to enter into a contract in the state of Indiana without consent from a parent or guardian, neither of whom had been obtained, or neither of which had been obtained. If the judge accepted either argument, Loveless could have been retried or released outright. However, after Small was unable to see his client the night before the hearing was delayed until December 2007. In January 2008, a sentence reduction and request to overturn Loveless's guilty plea was rejected by Jefferson Circuit Judge Ted Todd. Instead, Loveless will be eligible for parole in 15 years, thus maintaining the original guilty plea. In November 2008, Loveless's appeal was denied by the Indiana Court of Appeals, upholding Judge Todd's ruling. Mark Small stated that he will would seek to have jurisdiction over the case moved to the Indiana Supreme Court. The crime was documented in two true crime books, Little Lost Angel by Michael Quinlan and Cruel Sacrifice by Aphrodite Jones. Jones's book on the case became a New York Times bestseller. The story was turned into a play by Rob Urbinati called Hazelwood Junior High. Mean, an episode from the 5th season of Law and Order Special Victims Unit that aired in February 2004, was based on the murder. Cold Case second season episode The Sleepover is also based on this case. Scherer's father died of cancer in 2005, aged 53. He was buried beside his daughter. In an interview with Scherer's mother, Jacqueline Vaught, on the TV series Deadly Women, Vaught stated that Scherer's father was so devastated by his daughter's murder that he drank himself to death and died definitely from a broken heart. In January 2009, in other words, 17 years after the murder, the Shanda Scherer Scholarship Fund was established. It is written in the contract that the receiver or recipient will receive a plaque or document of some type that of type that tells sharer's story. The fund plans to provide scholarships to 2 students per year from Prosser School of Technology, New Albany. One scholarship will go to a student who is continuing his or her education, and the other scholarship will go to a student who is beginning his or her career and must buy tools and work equipment. In 2011, the Dr. Phil show aired a 2-part series on the crime, featuring interviews with Shanda's mother and sister, who also confronted Hope Rippey on the show. In August 2011, episode 11 Studios interviewed and filmed both Melinda Loveless at the Indiana Women's Prison and Jacqueline Bott at her office for a documentary they were producing titled Charlie's Scars. Loveless and Bott were closely featured in the documentary, which was submitted to the Sundance Film Festival in September 2011. In the wake of his daughter's sentencing hearing, where extensive open court testimony about Larry Loveless was given, he was arrested in February 1993 and brought back to Floyd County, Indiana to face charges of rape, sodomy, and sexual battery. Most of the crimes he was accused of occurred from 1968 to 1977. Loveless remained in prison for over 2 years awaiting trial. For some reason, a judge eventually ruled all except one count for sexual battery incident in 1989 had to be dropped due to the statute of limitations. In other words, the crimes were outdated. And the statute of limitations, at least for these crimes, except for the sexual battery incident in 1989, happens to be, or generally happens to be, only 5 years in Indiana. Quite strange given the fact that in a fairly Republican state, for example, former US Vice President and before that, former US Representative or Congressman and Senator Dan Quayle is from Indiana. Loveless eventually accepted a guilty plea for sexual battery and a sentence of time served and was released in June 1995. A few weeks following his release, Loveless was briefly, meaning Larry, not Melinda, in the news again, this time for unsuccessfully suing the Floyd County Jail for $39 million in federal court, alleging he had suffered cruel and unusual punishment during his 2-year incarceration. Unbelievable. May God have mercy on him. Among his complaints was that he was not allowed to sleep in his bed during the day and not allowed to read the newspaper. Well, some grievances. Yeah. But anyway, let's hope and pray that these sorts of crimes would at least be radically reduced this century and eventually end altogether.